Good morning, David. This is really, in the whole series of interviews that I've been doing in this Voices of the Regeneration, probably one of the calls that I, to some extent, was most nervous about, but also feel the most honored that I get a chance to speak to you. It's really a privilege to be able to have this conversation with you. So thank you so much for making time.
Well, thank you. That's very, very kind of you indeed.
So I've been, I'm originally a biologist myself, and I studied biology at Edinburgh University, and somehow got a little bit disheartened with the reductionist focus that behavioral biology had at the time. I studied zoology, wanted to become a marine biologist, and even in my early years working with Bernie LeBeouf in California on elephant seal populations. I'm sure you're aware of some of his work.
This is the early days of sociobiology.
I basically realized that there was something about the limitation of the viewpoint of conventional research science these days that didn't quite fit me as a box to spend my life in. But at the same time, I've always maintained that fascination for, basically I studied biology because I wanted to understand how life works and how the process of life, in Janine Benyus's words, creates conditions conducive to life. And partially got disheartened with biology because the mystique of the naturalist like Humboldt or Darwin was somehow taken away by the p-value of statistical significance and only quantifiable data being the data that could be part of the discourse. I just feel like saying that to situate yourself or myself within the context of our conversation, because then many years later I did a master's in holistic science, and I had the great fortune of studying with Professor Brian Goodwin, who has a very much complexity theory informed take on evolution. And just more recently in 2016, I published this book, Designing Regenerative Cultures, which just after the publication, a friend of mine put me in touch with a young man called Joe Brewer, who I hadn't known of before, but because my book had the title Designing Regenerative Cultures, this friend of mine, David Hodgson, said, you need to talk to Joe Brewer about culture design. And that's really when I first started to hear, because he spoke very highly of you, and he was working with you at the Evolution Institute at the time, I believe. And that's when I started looking into your work. And I feel like I need to apologize that I don't mention your work in my book. I just was aware of it afterwards. But it's very much aligned with one of the common themes in my book. And I understand that what you've developed over the last 30 years is a scientifically rigorous theory and argument based on Darwinian evolutionary theory that cooperation, altruism, and behavior in the benefit of the larger whole is actually something that evolution selects for. And that speaks to me so strongly, the whole notion that life isn't, like, we can see life as individuals competing with each other or species competing with each other. But that's just one slice of one way of seeing this planetary process that has, over the course of 3.8 billion years, made this planet more diverse, more abundant, more bioproductive, more capable of supporting more complex and diverse life forms. And normally I start this series with an invitation to the person to introduce themselves rather than read out a long bio. So I would love for you to basically tell your story a bit. How did you get into this work, and how has it been in the orthodox evolutionary field that somehow seems to be very enamored with the dogma of competition drives everything, to be a voice to say, no, actually, that's not quite how Darwinian evolution works.
Sure. Well, yeah, and I'll do it in a way that I think which connects to some very general themes and goes way beyond my own personal trajectory. I think it's almost inevitable, happens again and again with the study of any topic when you look at it historically, is that it begins with an appreciation of complexity. Because everything is so complex. And when you first encounter it, and especially before you try to study it formally, then you're thinking about it in words, you're describing it in words, and it's easy to emphasize the rich tapestry of life, the great complexity of economic systems, of course, physical systems, and so on, because after all, they are indubitably complex. But once you try to go beyond verbal descriptions and to study any topic more formally, for example, using mathematics, then inevitably simplification is required. I started my career as a mathematical modeler. Anyone who actually builds mathematical models knows how many simplifying assumptions you have to make just to grind through the math. So this is then, I think, a reductionistic phase that almost all topics go through. And there's great insights that come from that. You build your simple models, they do result in insights, but then ultimately they reveal their limitations. And it's at this point that you slowly begin to appreciate complexity again. It builds back to the study of complexity. And we really have to remember that the study of complex systems requires computational methods because analytical math is inherently limited. I like to refer to the distinction between the two-body problem and the three-body problem in physics. So, you know, the two-body problem, two celestial bodies rotating around each other in space, you can predict that with mathematical equations, no problem. Three bodies rotating around each other in space, that's like enormously complex. And even though you might be able to do it, if you alter the initial conditions even infinitesimally, then the trajectories will all be different. That's what we know as sensitive dependence on initial conditions. So without basically widespread computing, then there was just no way to go beyond analytical mathematical models. And widespread computing wasn't available until the closing decades of the 20th century. So we didn't even have the tools to scientifically study complex systems of any sort before those availability of those tools. And so that's why I think that when you encountered this and basically became a biologist during its reductionistic phase, then, and you found it lacking, then that might be for some of the reasons. Now, another thing that happened in evolutionary biology was that even though Darwin thought that his theory applied to all aspects of humanity in addition to the natural world, the study of evolution became highly gene-centric for most of the 20th century and had nothing whatsoever to say about culture. Nothing whatsoever to say about culture, especially, or much of anything to do with humans. And so the study of humans was ceded to other disciplines, the human-related disciplines, which but without reference to evolutionary theory, very often in perceived opposition to evolutionary theory. And so you have this archipelago of knowledge, which I frequently like to reflect on. Many islands of thought with little communication among islands. And you know, the triumph and the magnificence of evolutionary theory is its unifying capacity. And it has unified the biological sciences, but that unification has not yet taken place for the human-related sciences. That's what's in progress. So that's why my book is titled This View of Life, Completing the Darwinian Revolution. So it's only within the last, literally within the last 30 years, starting in the closing decades of the 20th century, that evolutionary thinkers went back to basics, and they said evolution, or Darwinian evolution, is any process that combines the three ingredients of variation, selection, and replication. Any process. Genetic evolution is one such process, but there are others. Mm-hmm. There are others. In fact, there's many of them. And so this broadening out of evolutionary theory, now encompassing at last Darwin's vision of encompassing all things human, is what's on offer today. I think it's really a grand synthesis. We look back on the 20th century, we say, oh, what a period of synthesis. Well, that's where we are now with respect to human-related knowledge. And as you can see, I have a great passion for partaking in it.
I mean, let me just, because I mentioned Brian Goodwin earlier. Brian taught me, also related to the three-body problem, he had this slightly oversimplified definition of a complex system, saying any system that has more than three interacting variables is a complex system. And then he would often say, and once you're in that realm, their behavior is fundamentally unpredictable or uncontrollable beyond the very limited temporal spatial scale. You can wrestle some predictability from the system if you define the boundaries, both temporally and spatially, in a limited way. But if you really look at it in its context, it's fundamentally unpredictable and controllable. And his conclusion, and that's an axiomatic change in science, is that he was sort of speaking to the fact that throughout the scientific revolution and for the beginning years of science and its diversification into all these silos and disciplines, it was all about increasing prediction, control, and manipulation of nature. It was the sort of binding nature and all these quotes that we know from Bacon and so on. And he said that what complexity science is offering is a fundamental reframe towards appropriate participation. That since we cannot predict and control, we actually have to understand how do we best fit into this nested wholeness of life's ongoing exploration of novelty. Does that resonate with your perspective, or do you think that now we have the AI to actually wrestle predictability from life or complex systems?
Well, it does resonate, but in a very complicated way. And to get back to the three-body problem, the most wonderful demonstration of that for me, and it's in part an artistic demonstration, is the jointed pendulum. And I didn't know anything about jointed pendulums until I was just poking around the internet. But you know, a pendulum that's just a single stick that you know swings back and forth, that's totally predictable. But all you need to do is to take that very same pendulum and give it a couple of joints. So now that you know they can, and then trace its trajectory. Like just imagine that this is going back and forth, and a little pen is tracing its trajectory. It traces the most beautiful artwork as these joints, you know, the different arms of the, you know, are swinging around each other and stuff like that. And of course, every time you set it in motion, it traces a different picture. So just going from a single arm pendulum to a jointed pendulum with 2 or 3 arms undergoes that transition from something that is very simple and predictable to something that is just infinite in its variety. And yet at the same time, complex systems there's plenty of pattern in complex systems. You know, there's multiple basins of attraction. Systems come to rest on one of them. So it demonstrates that kind of local equilibrium. And here's a very important point, that living complex systems, because they are sculpted by natural selection, are perfectly predictable. We know, we can predict, I mean, to an impressive degree, the way animals are, how they adapt, and so on and so forth. So complex systems need to be divided into two categories. One is complex systems in general, of course. That's the most general category. Then there's non-living complex systems, and there's living complex systems. And living complex systems, because they have been sculpted by natural selection, have a great deal of predictor. Look at our anatomy and physiology. So all kinds of predictability there must be if any entity is going to be well adapted to survive and reproduce in its environment. And I think a lot about this because, and I'd be interested to know your experience. You've already kind of alluded to this aversion to an overly mechanistic conception of how we can engineer things, as if it's some great machine that we can build and run. And there seems to be something wrong about that to many people. And as an alternative, often people turn to various kinds of organic metaphors, such as an ecosystem or a garden. And the gardening, cultivating a garden, is perceived to be importantly different than a machine. And the machine, the garden metaphor is seen to be importantly different than the machine metaphor. Now that fascinates me because I actually am a gardener. I love to garden. And I know how much work is required to plan and maintain a garden. So much work, so much weeding, so much cultivation, so much attention to the plants to figure out what makes them. And often it's filled with uncertainties. If something's not going well in your garden, well, you don't actually know exactly what it is. So you have to try this and that. But nevertheless, the idea that gardens don't need to be, that the word manage is wrong for a garden, I don't get that. I mean, there's an intense form of management that's taken place. So, and I puzzle over that. So with our systems, with our social systems, our economic systems, our interactions with nature, oh my heavens, I mean, we have to do some form of management. It's going to be the gardening form. It's actually called adaptive management. That's probably a term that's familiar to you. What is adaptive management? Basically, you're working with a complex system. You try stuff out to the best of your knowledge, and you assess to see if it's working. And if it's not, you try something else. That's what adaptive management is, and it's what we need to do. So, but it's a form of management. So, I don't know, what do you think of all that?
No, I completely agree. I think that there's a nuance difference just in the framing of it, that I think that there's too much of a tendency that we believe that with improved science and improved technology, we can really control, and the uncertainty factor is still present. And so while it's not saying that we can't control a lot, like Brian would call it, setting the enabling constraints for positive emergence. So something in the system is going to emerge, and emergence has become a bit of a buzzword that is very flatly used by a lot of people, but because emergence can be good or bad in the system depending on what values you put in, what you assume to be good or bad in the system. But it's the notion of really understanding that there is always something that is beyond our knowing, that the complexity of the nested system within which our planet sits is such that we can always be thrown a curveball, and that just sets us a base attitude of humility And I quite like this notion of appropriate participation. It doesn't mean, like, it can be very much in the sense of a gardener setting the enabling constraints. Like, I find it very dangerous right now in this conversation around we need to move from ego to eco, or more and more people criticizing all of humanity and our destructive actions on the planet, trying to create a picture of rewilding as places devoid of human beings. For me, that would be bowing out of our responsibility that as agents in this life as a planetary process system, we have interfered with it on every continent, in every ecosystem on the planet by now. And therefore, we have the role of becoming conscious participants in evolution and humble keystone species that try to increase bioproductivity and diversity and systemic resilience at multiple levels of scale to the best of our abilities, but from this base attitude of acknowledging uncertainty and uncontrollability, because that will just, to my mind, set the frame under which we then avoid large geoengineering processes where we believe like arrogantly believe that if we just throw X tons of ferrous oxide in the oceans, we will cause algal blooms and that will then draw down CO2. For me, it's that hubris of playing with a system that is too complex to control at that scale that we need to work against.
Yeah, so I agree 100%. One of the lessons of complex systems is humility, because we are immersed in we are complex systems, and we're immersed who live within complex systems. And by definition, complex systems are filled with unforeseen consequences. So we'll never have enough knowledge, really, to know the consequences of our actions. That's why we must always be humble, and we must try things out, and then assess what works, and then replicate those. I think that's sensitive to context. So even if we figure out something that works here, it won't necessarily work there without tweaking. That's how humble we have to be. So humility is absolutely called for. There's point one. I think that's everyone should agree upon that. That's revealed, I think, with the pandemic, where I mean, some of the really bad ideas like herd immunity were the result of models and scientists. I mean, the models were telling them that would be well, turned out not to be the case. So it's like the weather. I think the weather forecasting is a great metaphor for what has to take place with all complex systems. The weather is a complex physical system. It's so complex that with all of the effort that we put onto it, we still can't predict the fucking weather, can we?
Yeah.
Not even a few days ahead of time. And so we have an arsenal of models. We're gathering data at an incredible refreshing rate, the data again and again and again. And then we test our models, and that's how we do it. Well, actually, all complex systems need to be on that, need to be much like that. But I want to say some more about natural systems. It's so very important. And all of this is paradigmatic, which means that if you don't get it, you're in some other paradigm, then it's going to shape your worldview. And if you get it, the new paradigm, then it's going to reshape your worldview. In both cases, it can be highly intuitive and commonsensical, but work is required to go from one paradigm to another. And there's a very strong tendency to think that nature left to itself strikes some form of harmonious balance. And that's, I mean, the whole wilderness ethic that you just talked about is just, get humans out of there, and then nature will revert to its state, which is some kind of benign state. That's actually a pre-Darwinian notion. That's a Christian notion. In the Christian worldview is that the world was created by God and is therefore well ordered from top to bottom. Darwin's theory of evolution tells us something very different. Evolution does not make everything nice. Evolution results in all kinds of outcomes that are horrible from a human standpoint: exploitative, predatory, competitive. And so there's all kinds of single species social groups and multi-species communities that would be just despotic in human terms. The very last kind of society that we would want to live in. I have a number of podcasts on this with biologists, including a primatologist named Joan Silk, who should know. I mean, just imagine living in a society who's just basically Donald Trump won, and everyone's like him now. Dominating individuals. What would it be like if a male comes into your group, kills your children, and then insists that you mate with him to have his children, and then some other bastard comes and kills them, and you have to repeat the cycle? But you have to put up with it, because if you were to leave, then you'd be on your own, and that would be certain death. Think about that. Think about the most abusive relationship that you could imagine. The kind of relationship where just someone threatens to kill you if you leave, but you have to put up with it. Think about that being just the way entire species have been shaped. And it's just never going to be different, because that's the way the selection pressures have just molded the species. And so community ecologists in modern day use the word regime when they talk about multi-species communities. They talk about biological regimes. And I think that's such a great word, because we have an intuition about human political regimes. A regime is somewhat stable. Otherwise, you'd never call it a regime, right? So the word regime conveys a degree of stability, but it does not convey how good or bad that regime is. A regime can be an enlightened regime. It can be a despotic regime. The word regime is agnostic, but the quality of the regime for those who live within it. And so it turns out that natural regimes, biological regimes, are like human regimes. They do not strike a harmonious balance left to themselves necessarily. And so the hard lesson of evolution is that there is no functional organization without a process of selection. The reason that individuals are functionally organized, that we function so well as collections of trillions of cells, is because of natural selection operating at the individual level. The reason that social insect colonies function as well as they do is because of a process of natural selection operating at the colony level. If human groups function as cooperative units, it's thanks only to a process of selection at that level. At that level. If nations function well, it's only because of a process of selection at that level. And if the planet is going to function well, it will only be thanks to a process of selection, in this case, policy selection, in which we base our actions on the good of the planet. The whole concept of laissez-faire, that basically that lower level entities can pursue their interests and that works out for the common good, is just profoundly untrue. It's untrue in economics, it's untrue in biology. And so, so now we're getting into the concept of multi-level selection.
Just briefly on that, what I understand you are saying with multi-level selection is that, well, I mean, there's the famous phrase that you get probably quoted at more often than you would like to rehear that phrase of selfish individuals will outcompete within groups, and altruistic groups will outcompete selfish groups. That all else is what was I can't remember the exact line.
The mantra, this
all
is
that commentary.
the concluding sentence of my article with the other Wilson, Edward O. Wilson. Selfishness beats altruism within groups. Altruistic groups beats selfish group. Everything else is commentary.
Yeah, that's the one. Thank you. Ultimately, what I understand is that, like in my framing around regeneration, working with friends, like for example, Bill Sharp has this framing of saying that all life exists within the tension of being for oneself and being as part of a larger whole. And that speaks to this multi-level nestedness that on the one hand, we have these individual benefits from acting in a certain way, but we're also dependent on the larger group, also multi-species groups, maintaining the viability of the system that we are actually drawing viability from. And what I've understood you're saying is that the difficulty of making these jumps in evolution to taking care of the larger system is that actually is often not as advantageous for individuals or groups or nations within that next higher level. Is that correct?
It is correct, and it's often something that often is and can be stated as a form of self-interest, that you can say, you know, in order for you to benefit, you must benefit the social group that you're in or the ecology that you're in. And so the most enlightened form of self-interest is to work on behalf with others on behalf of these larger entities. Mm-hmm. The problem with that way of thinking is that it basically it fails to appreciate that natural selection is based on relative fitness, not absolute fitness. It's not a matter of like, you should do A because that's better for you than if you do B. That's a comparison of your fitness and under the assumption that people will be motivated to maximize their absolute fitness. But evolution is always based on who's doing better than who. And it's relative. And the best example of that is cancer. Cancer cells proliferate at the expense of normal cells within the body. The normal cells are the solid citizen cells. They're the ones that are acting on their enlightened self-interest, you might say, participating with other cells to keep the whole organisms alive. Cancer cells don't do that. They're the short-sighted selfish kind, and they're ultimately going to kill themselves each and every time they bring about their own demise. And so, but nevertheless, cancer cells, it's just they proliferate faster than the normal cells. That's it. That's it. And so they increase in frequency. Every time there's a mutation that causes a cell to proliferate at the expense of it just happens. And then with subsequent mutations, it happens more. Then they evolve to disperse. That's metastasis. That's just natural selection taking place within the body based on a relative fitness. It has no foresight. It has no foresight. And so if you pair the enlightened self-interest person who says, oh, I'll be better off, we'll all be better off if we work together, that's in our enlightened self-interest. And then if you put in a short-sighted selfish person who exploits that, well, they'll win. It's relative fitness, my friend. And so the selfish individual, even if it's not intentional, will proliferate, benefit at the expense of the collective. There's no foresight. There's no foresight. It just happens. And so if you have nations trying to grow their economy, and that ends up overheating the earth, and then we look at that and see, how can you do that when it's bad for us all? Well, it just happens.
But how would you
consequences? And so this is to be smarter in terms of formulating our policy, not just appealing to enlightened self-interest. We have to create social organizations which are protective against various forms of disruptive, lower level activities. They have to be constructed in order to prevent disruptive forms of cheating and free riding and all of these things which are beneficial at a small scale, but disruptive at a large scale. If you're not protecting yourselves against them, they will happen. There are various forms of cancer will take place.
So how would you, in terms of the urgency of the human predicament that we're currently faced with regard to the jury is still out how many years or decades we still got left, but somewhere between less than a decade and maybe 2 or 3 decades to avoid cataclysmic climate change, just hitting runaway feedbacks mechanisms in the climate system that even if we then all pulled together and did the right thing, we'd have to admit to ourselves that it's too late. I mean, obviously the work that you've done with pro-social seems to suggest that there is a chance that we could rearrange our activity in such a way that we incentivize pro-social behavior, that we set policies that are for the benefit of life as a planetary process and therefore for the longevity of humanity. Like what you said earlier, I just wanted to double check that I heard you right, because in my perspective, in order to rematch in terms of the whole redesign of the human impact on the planet, rematch our activities in the way we meet our needs to the biophysical realities of ecosystems and the biosphere, we actually need to relocalize some of our patterns quite drastically. Because as you also said earlier, it's all about context. So one solution that fits in one place might not fit in another place. We need to match our solutions to the diversity of conditions of each ecosystem and each culture. That for me suggests, and there's a lot of people working on this from different angles, the Planetary Health Alliance from a more population health perspective, or the Capital Institute's Regenerative Communities Network and bioregional initiatives around economic regeneration. It suggests a bioregional approach, an approach where we fit human activities back to the unique conditions of each bioregion or ecosystem that they live in, but it requires global collaboration between bioregions to do this process. Do you think that runs against all that you see from the study of evolution as a process, or can you fit? Because to my mind, Eleanor Ostrom's work on the commons is critical on how to enable people at a bioregional scale to wisely manage the resources within that bioregion in such a way that they don't impinge on bioregions elsewhere and actually enable bioregions elsewhere to do the same thing. Does that resonate with your work or not?
Sure, I think what you just outlined for a bioregional approach is exactly what we need to be reaching for. So there's our Amiga point. Basically, there's our goal. It's a kind of a multi-level governance that is has the global good in mind, but also is, and that's reflected in all the intermediate layers of organization, the bioregions, the cities, and all the way down to lower levels of governments, especially the level of smaller groups, which we'll get to. But so by all means, that is our target of selection, you might say. And so it's a matter of how we actually get there. How do we actually achieve that that vision? And before I comment on that, I just wanted to point out, as others have, I'm no expert on this topic, that irreversible climate change and kind of leading to a cataclysmic tipping point. That's true for humans, but it's not true for the rest of life on Earth.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I've heard it said that the Earth could be 6 degrees Celsius warmer. That'd be just fine for the rest of life on Earth. Just bad for us, real bad for us. So I think that we need to keep that in mind. So now back to the question is how we actually achieve this vision that you articulated very well. And I really want to stress that is our goal. That's exactly what we want to do. But how do we go about doing it? And Ostrom herself wrote about this in one of the last papers that she wrote on multi-level governance. She called it polycentric governance. And I was privileged, as I think you know, to work with her for 3 years prior to her death. And what we did was we generalized her work from a evolutionary perspective. And we showed that what she derived for a certain kind of group, common pool resource groups, is basically applies to all groups whose members are trying to cooperate with each other. You can think of cooperation as itself a common pool a resource. So there's a set of principles that can be, I mean, it's really amazing when you think of it. Just think carefully, absorb this. I ask your listeners to absorb this. There is a simple set of principles that applies to all kinds of groups, no matter what they are trying to do. And those same principles are scale independent. They can govern relations among groups in addition to relations within groups. Wouldn't you want to know about those principles? I would. So that's what's on offer.
But
and
when I read those strong group identity and understanding of purpose, 1, fair distribution of costs and benefits, 2, fair and inclusive decision makings, 3, monitoring agreed upon behaviors, 4, graduated sanctions for misbehaviors, 5, fast and fair conflict resolution, 6, authority to self-govern, 7, appropriate relationships with other groups, 8. It sounds very similar. It sounds neat. But you also, in other works that I've been listening to videos and so on, you looked at eco-villages and then intentional communities, and we would have a lot of places to go here. But in my experience from having worked with eco-villages and having worked with the people willing to work together and manage common pool resources, it's actually not that easy to create, for example, mechanisms for fast and fair conflict resolution. So in the detail of how to apply these 8 principles, there's a lot of hard work to be done. Or have you seen them applied gracefully in all sorts of contexts without bumping into human complexity?
Yeah, so there's so much to say here, and it's paradoxical. So let's spend some time on this. First, it's very important to remind ourselves exactly what Ostrom showed for common pool resource groups, which she studied around the world. What she showed was that they varied in their ability to avoid the tragedy of the commons. Not all of them were able to manage their common pool resources, only some. There was your bell-shaped curve. Only some were able to manage their commons. Most were in between. And then there were the disasters on the other end of the bell curve. So common pool resource groups that she studied varied from the best to the worst. The best employed these core design principles, and that's what made them work so well. Now, generalizing the core design principles means that when we examine any other kind of groups, schools, businesses, neighborhoods, families, nonprofits, any cooperative endeavor, you'll find your bell-shaped curve. Some will work spectacularly well, most will be in the middle, and then you'll have your basket cases on the other end of the bell curve. That goes for intentional communities as well as any other kind of group. And we've done research on this to basically back up that claim. As it turns out, the research that we've done unintentional communities shows that as a group, they perform pretty well. The bell-shaped curve is kind of shifted in the good direction for that particular kind of group. But even so, all kind of variation. So it is not the case that all groups just spontaneously implement the core design principle. Not at all. That's why work is required. But actually, that's your first task. Your first task is to work at the scale of small, functionally oriented groups. And I'll say more about that in a minute. And then, of course, we need to work at still larger scales. But if the small groups aren't working well, then larger society is not going to work well. That's for sure. So one project, and it's quite a doable project. This is something that anybody who's listening to this can do. If they're already in groups that are meaningful to them, then they can learn about this approach and they can make their groups function better. If they're not in a group, well, find one or to make one. Work in groups. And I'll say more about that in a minute. So there's something that's an incredibly important insight to be able to make about working at the level of small groups, which everyone can do. And then, of course, those groups have to be coordinated. That's when we go up in scale.
The suspicion I have that in that data set that Ostrom studied, one of the common patterns for the ones that failed, because not all of these 8 principles, the authority to self-govern is one of those slightly slippery ones, because that's not entirely within the jurisdiction of the group itself. And very often what I think is the most destructive factor of a group of people trying to manage a common pool resource is if they're embedded in a system that is actually stacked against them. And I find this over and over now when I have conversations with people around, could I turn my company over to being a regenerative company? If we're still in the zero-sum competitive environment of the current economic playing field, it is very difficult for companies to really become regenerative because the playing field is stacked against them. And my sense is that some of these common pool resource management attempts failed because of that. They're nested within a larger system that also influenced their success and failure.
Yeah, the core design principles are a little bit like the organs of your body. Everyone is needed. You'll move a single one and you die. Mm-hmm. So, and it's not quite that bad, but there is a sense in which a group can fail for lack of any one of the core design principles. And the one that you've pointed out, local autonomy, mm-hmm. The groups just don't have the elbow room, or they're operating in a larger environment that's stacked against them. That is indeed huge. Make no mistake. Yeah. And you and I have both done a lot of reading about that. Lately, I've been reading about platform cooperatives, which I'll bet you know about as well. The idea that basically, things like Airbnb and Uber and Lyft, the gig economy, those could actually work pretty well if they weren't so exploitative, if they weren't so locked into the capitalist model. And come to try to create a cooperative platform, and you realize that there's all kind of legislation that's stacked against it that makes it hard, not easy. And whenever I talk to people, which I do all the time about this sort of thing, and they talk about their institutional environment, mostly it's the institutional environment is a problem, is basically holding them back. That was my own experience when I tried to, the first project that I tried to start in my hometown of Binghamton. Nevertheless, there's many internal problems. How many groups is there an unequal allocation of costs and benefits? In other words, some people do most of the work, some members of the group do most of the work, other members get the benefit. And how many groups, especially in businesses, is decision-making not fair and equitable? Some people within the group don't have, aren't part of the decision-making process. And how many groups is it the case that basically there's no monitoring of agreed upon behavior? It goes on and on. So every group needs to do an assessment, and then they need to improve the things that they're in a position to improve upon. And if there's things that they can't control, then those are obstacles that we need to move around. And that actually introduces another element of pro-social, which is just as important as the core design principles, which is the capacity to be adaptable, flexible, and evolvable. So just because you have an aspiration doesn't mean you can achieve it. I like to say that every year we make our New Year's resolutions, and every year we fail to keep them. So, and the same is true for groups. A group could decide to implement the core design principles better. That doesn't mean that they can do it any more than we can achieve our New Year's resolutions. And so there's a whole process that's required in order to become unstuck, and to move towards our valued goals. And here, these techniques come from like therapy, mindfulness-based therapy, which turns out to be highly evidence-based. I mean, there's techniques that work that can make you more flexible as an individual and as an organization. These are teachable skills, and that's great to know.
And this is what you've been setting up with the pro-social platform, prosocial.world, to enable people to train to work with groups, organizations, businesses, cooperatives, units of people.
This is our grand platform that we're trying to create, and I invite all of your listeners to check it out. Basically, we're trying to create the architecture for working at all scales, starting with groups, to make them more flexible, and to, in evolutionary terms, to accomplish a major transition so that these internal divisive interactions, disruptive interactions, the group becomes protected against them, and that they could operate as an organism, basically, as a group level organism.
I mean, I sense talking to you that there is such a powerful synergy between your work and this impulse of working regeneratively, because regeneratively might be a bit obscure as a word, but it is basically working from a developmental and evolutionary perspective, understanding that the idea that there is some sort of regenerative culture or sustainable future or sustainable human settlement that we can just design on a drawing board and then implement everywhere the same kind of pattern. And once we arrive there, we can happily live ever after is, of course, completely limited. And the idea of working regeneratively is working with people in place to build the capacity of these people to both individually and as a group contribute the uniqueness of what each individual or the group carries as a unique essence and contribution to the evolutionary process, to be able to express that within the context of the larger whole that they're sitting in. And it's literally building the flexibility and adaptability into the groups, the social system, that we can continue to evolve and adapt to a changing environment, but we do so with the understanding that at every level, the maximum potential can only be expressed through the appropriate fit into the larger nested level, and in a way that it's in my language from my academic, like my PhD was in design for human and planetary health, and I borrowed Aaron Antonovsky's notion of salutogenic approach to health to coin this idea of salutogenic design, and that marries very well with the sort of regenesis lineage. What do you contribute to the next wider nested whole, and how do you maintain the capacity to evolve of the wider system that your system is embedded in? So it feels very much aligned. And I'd love you to say a little bit more about these processes. Like if people are listening and saying, I want to work with my group, my bioregional regeneration initiative, or my eco-village community, on applying these principles, where would they go, and how would they get involved with experimenting?
Yeah, well, so happy that you've raised this set of issues, and there is alignment, a huge degree of alignment. So much that we have to ask the question, what's the added value? That if you're in this particular movement have more or less converged upon the same vision, then what's the added value? Maybe I've just reinvented the wheel, talking about the same stuff in different ways. And now I think that's not the case, and I'll now explain why that is. There's so many convergences of this sort. That's one interesting point to make. It's almost like, it's almost not an exaggeration to see every day I come upon people and organizations that's more or less converged upon the same awareness and best practices. Sociocracy is one that I could holocracy is another. I've really made a hobby of looking in the management literature. Business corporations often have some of them have come upon ingenious ways to evolve their futures. Typically, it's the objectives of the business, which might be a corporate objectives, but nevertheless, they've developed magnificent procedures, basically continuing improvement procedures, variation and selection procedures, in order to get better and better and better at what they're trying to do. If they could turn that genius to the global good, then that would be just and if you look at any one of these and you ask, what is its narrative? What is its origin? What is its justification? How does it explain itself? What is its rationale? How does it replicate? What you find is that there's a lot of localism in that. These tend to arise in a particular time and place, and they're described with a certain vocabulary. They spread to a degree based on their success, but then they come up against limits beyond which they are truly unknown. Truly unknown. No one's ever heard of them. So, they're famous and well-known within their sphere, but then they come up against limits. And did I say that decades was required for them to spread to the limits to the degree that they do? And this is so much. This is why I'm so happy, and I'll bet you are too, to actually have a biological background, because isn't that the way species are? Species originate in a certain time and place. They spread on the basis of their success, and then they come up against limits, their geographical distribution. And so what's needed to go beyond this kind of limited success is to be able to formulate it in more general terms, so that we could really see what are the principles that can be applied to any group, any context, any scale. That general level of description based basically on foundational theory. And you can't get more foundational than complex systems theory and evolutionary theory. When you state it that way, and if you actually bring into bear state-of-the-art assessment and things like that, then you've got something that's capable of spreading worldwide and fast, and basically providing a common language that all of these different traditions that have indeed happened upon the same thing and have all kind of wisdom based on experience that to draw upon can actually merge and combine in a way that was not taking place before. You've transcended this archipelago structure of knowledge and practice. So that's what we're doing, and it's so exciting to see it happening in a collaborative and not a competitive spirit. That and then I'd want to spread that still further in your area, basically, of regenerative design. Would be we will learn from you, and we can add value in terms of the practices what we're attempting to do.
Absolutely. I mean, I came across, just doing the research for our conversation, I came across this report that the Evolution Institute did for the B corporations in 2016. I think it was entitled "Doing Well by Doing Good," and in it you summarize these three very basic kind of behavioral rules for effective groups. I think it was group members must appropriately coordinate their actions. They must avoid disruptive self-serving behaviors within the group, and they must cultivate appropriate relationship with other groups. And that again speaks to this nested architecture of group, community, bioregion. I personally think that we might have gone down a sort of maladaptive detour by adding an superfluous socio-political layer called the nation state, and I personally feel that that's an anachronism that we probably will do without in 200 years' time. I think we need a global governance system that enables subsidiarity down to bioregions and communities as the structure. But
I'm glad you used the word subsidiarity, which is a Catholic concept, and federalism is another, which is this nested. And I think that it's part of cultural evolution that it always builds upon what already exists. And so we have a global village of nations right now. We also have other entities. We have obviously corporate entities. We have religious entities. These are the existing intermediate scales of social organization. And with that as the starting point, and this is something else which has happened in the past, and it's based so much on a perspective. It's a perspective change that can be the game changer. And once again, it's not new. It's happened in the past and to some extent in the present. As for a nation, for example, or a leader of a nation, to see themselves and their nation as a solid citizen of the world. I have a conversation with, as part of a series called Evolution, Complexity, and the Third Way of Entrepreneurship, if we could provide a link to this series of conversation that basically reviews foreign policy of people like Woodrow Wilson, who was a globalist. I mean, he was an advocate of the United Nations, for example. I mean, he was responsible for the United States entering World War I, because not to be an isolationist, because basically it's that enlightened form of self-interest where if you're for our own long-term good, we really have to be working towards the global good. Now that is a form of nationalism, it's a form of patriotism, but it's a form that subordinates itself to a higher good and then seeks to have a higher reputation towards that end. And of course that involves sanctions against nations that don't do that, and that whole protective, basically the core design principles operating at a national scale. So the point being is that our current organizations, governance structures of all kinds uh, can be part of the solution as soon as they adopt that perspective of subordinating themselves to the higher global good. And we see that, for example, with the Pope's encyclical, Our Common Home, speaks to the whole earth, not just to the Catholic faith. We get the Dalai Lama, ethics for the whole world, beyond religion. And so it happens again and again that entities are not narrowly selfish. They work for the common good. And it's there that to succeed, they need to apply those same golden principles. Those same principles that are needed at a small scale are needed at that large scale, and the same flexibility.
I mean, you just recently had the opportunity to have within the Mind Life Institute series to have a conversation with the Dalai Lama.
Right.
I'll link that also with this conversation so people can have a look at it. But is it so? You mentioned that subsidiarity is a Catholic concept. I'm aware of it as a political philosophy that is written into the European Constitution, and that we should actually be governed in this way. But I'm not aware of the Catholic past of this term. Enlighten me.
Well, I'm not a scholar on the topic, but I believe the concept originated in the Catholic faith, and then was borrowed in the formation of the European Union. Mm-hmm. And basically, the principle is that the lower level entities should be able to do things their way, and the higher level entities, such as the church, should step in only when problems are caused higher up the scale. And that's also the principle of federalism, is that the states and the cities and the towns have a degree of authority to govern their affairs, and only when it causes problems higher up the scale does something else kick in. So, and then the European Union adopted those same principles.
But how do you sense, like in terms of implementing the 8 design principles in a scale linking way from small communities to bioregions to basically a global collaborative network of groups, humanity trying to keep the planet viable for humanity to some extent, and the rest of life, is the current economic system not stacked against that kind of system emerging? So, like, because you've done a lot of work in economics as well, and really looked into this, and you helped launch the Evonomics website. And what's your take on to what extent we need a fundamental redesign of our economic system? Is it a retrofit of capitalism, or is capitalism in and of itself the very notion of owning the means of production that then actually sabotages a common pool resource, because suddenly you don't have the principle, which is fair distribution of cost and benefits, don't really exist anymore if you have land ownership and some sort of retribution for, I'll let you work my land and therefore I don't really need to do very much, but you need to give me something because I own the land. Where do you see the need of this, which is also starting everywhere at the moment with the We All Alliance and lots of not so alternative. 20 years ago, it was very alternative groups who were trying to work on alternative economic models. And it was heresy to critique the growth imperative in our current economic system. Now this has changed completely, and everybody seems to be in agreement that the current economic system is broken and driving maladaptive behaviors. Sorry about the somebody's having an opinion on this. So yeah, I would love to hear you on how to bring these principles into a new form of economic playing field that actually would enable us to build that scale linking system.
Well, this enables me to describe this series of conversations that I already alluded to, evolution, complexity, and the third way of entrepreneurship. Let me briefly describe its thesis and then some of the conversations around it, which is an answer to your question. So the thesis of the third way is that there's two things that don't work and only one thing that can work. One thing that doesn't work is laissez-faire, because it's just profoundly not the case that the pursuit of lower level self-interest robustly benefits the common good. The metaphor of the invisible hand is profoundly untrue, unless the invisible hand is actually our own systemic efforts to construct an economy that works at the systemic scale. The other thing that doesn't work is centralized planning, because the world is too complex to be planned by any group of experts. And those, of course, are the two major narratives of social change. So the only thing that can work is a managed process of cultural evolution with systemic goals in mind. In other words, we must have a systemic target of selection, the welfare of the whole earth ultimately, or subsystem. There must be variation oriented around the target, and then there must be the replication of best practices, realizing that they're sensitive to context. Now, it's against that background that we can appreciate both the errors of capitalism and the errors of socialism. And one of the essays, one of the conversations is with Geoffrey Hodgson, who's a great scholar of the social sciences in England. And he, if you didn't know before, then you really should know that every concerted effort at socialism has been a cataclysmic failure. And for two reasons. One is they tried to do away with markets altogether and to base their economy on centralized planning. That was problem number one. Problem number two is that power got concentrated in the hands of a few elites. And we know how that always goes. So even for socialist movements that started out well-meaning, genuinely well-meaning, then all of them became basically totalitarian and failed abysmally because of their reliance on centralized planning. And if we want some version of socialism, we all have to be clear, not that kind, please. Then we have the errors of capitalism that are well known. So what's in between? Where are some examples of the third way? The third way is not new, because it's the only thing that can work. It's the only thing that ever has worked. And so we can see them again and again described in all their local vocabularies, as I mentioned before. And it will come as no surprise that the Nordic countries, good old Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and Iceland, plus some other nations that are, and all of the analyses, books such as Why Nations Fail, The Spirit Level, that basically rank nations on how well they function at the national scale. If you look at the high end, which always includes the Nordic countries plus others, we don't want to focus exclusively on the Nordic countries, and you find that these are societies that work well. And then come to look closer as to why they work well. It's because they have actually created a wonderful balance. They're market economies, make no mistake. They are definitely market economies that are competing on the world stage, but labor is also strong, and the state is strong, and they're all working collaboratively in order to improve the national good. And I was just, literally 2 days ago, I had my conversation with some colleagues in Norway on this topic for that series. And just to give you a great illustration, there's something called the flexicurity model that was first developed in Denmark and is now practiced widely also in Norway. And it goes this way. Because these small nations are exposed to the world economy, they have to be really nimble on the market. And so that means that any particular sector has to be able to hire and fire workers quite quickly. You can't be stodgy that way. And so there has to be security for workers, but it can't be of the sort that they just have job security and they can't, then the economy couldn't evolve. So what they do is they combine the ability to hire and fire at will with a great social security system, so that if you lose your job, actually for a period of even 4 years initially, now it's been reduced to 2 years, you could continue on 90% of your salary until you can retrain for the next job. And so you combine social security with a responsive economy. That's what they call flexicurity. And it was worked out basically by a collaborative arrangements with the labor unions and the business sector with very strong state involvement. So these go by names such as democratic socialism and similar names, which basically combine the word socialism. That means that everything is explicitly designed for the good of the society, but also democratic. There's your participation. So it's not just in the hands of a few elites. And then that's represented by an equality of power among the major sectors, such as labor and capital and so on. So there's our model, and not hard to emulate. Every nation has to find its own path. There's more to be said about that, but anyhow, there's a model to follow.
But don't you find, like I saw a talk that you gave to the Business for Peace Foundation, and you kind of contrasted that current orthodox economic design is, I think, what did you say, has an absurd conception of human nature, has an absurd conception of economic systems equilibrium, and has an absurd conception of theory as mathiness, which I very much like because it kind of resonates with my issue around qualitative and quantitative focuses or foci. And then you say that the other option, by building an evolutionary an economics theory on multi-level selection, we can build it on the most current knowledge about human nature, social economic systems in all of their complexity, and the conception that is commensurate with evolutionary theory and complexity. And problem is that it seems like both academically and in terms of national policy making, economics has built this wall of orthodoxy around it, that it's very difficult to actually have these conversations about redesigning national and international economic policies. Are you making an inroad there?
Yeah, so I mean, I've written extensively on that, including that particular talk, and it's absolutely the case that everything that we know with the, gathered under the term homo economicus is a huge part of the problem. I talked about paradigmatic change earlier, and so that's a paradigm that actually only became dominant after World War II. Was a fringe position before then, but then did become truly dominant, remains dominant, and has got to go, basically. It does have to be replaced with a more holistic view. This represented by people such as Kate Raworth and her Doughnut Economics. It's systemic. Basically, there's your third way. A systemic goal and means towards working towards that goal. So the question becomes, how fast are we going to have that paradigm change so that we really leave homo economicus behind, and then we adopt this more systemic approach. And I've been now kind of beginning as a total outsider 10 or 12 years ago, have now become more of an insider. And I see a lot of flexibility. I mean, it's gotten to the point of collapse, close enough to the point of collapse that people that are very well positioned inside the economic establishment, they get it. and they're really happy to experiment. So I do think that we've reached the point, and it does take a collapse, it does take a crisis in order to move people beyond their entrenched positions. But I think one thing I'd like to do, Daniel, is to talk a little bit more specifically about regenerative movements, and to describe one that we're involved with pro-social, that I'd like to get your opinion on it to see how closely it matches some of the regenerative movements that you're involved with. And this one is called Forever Green. It's based in Minnesota. Mm-hmm. And we're also working with a group called Regenerate Illinois. And it's all about regenerative agriculture, which is, if anything qualifies as a paradigm shift, it's to transition from the current agricultural practices in the American Midwest to a more regenerative form of agriculture, using, for example, perennial crops, so that you're not just breaking up the soil again and again, and to create a system which is attuned to everything from biodiversity to, of course, management of the soil that turns into water management, and to be really holistic about the system that you're trying to create. And as soon as you try to do that, then you realize that if you're going to, for example, raise a new crop, such as a perennial wheat crop, then there has to be a whole supply chain that you build around it. You just can't insert that one practice. You have to be working on the whole supply chain. And so that is what, and it should be at the watershed level. If you're going to be ecologically sound, you have to start thinking about biological units, not just political units. And so here we have like a number of movements that are like that. And then the question is, how well do they work, and how much better might they work if we begin to come in with a program such as pro-social, which is explicitly evolutionary, not just in terms of the core design principles, but in terms of this flexibility part. Here's the thing we want to do, but how do we actually do it? How do we get unstuck and become flexible about moving in at all scales, from the individual to the smaller group, so on and so forth. So this is just starting, and I feel lucky that we've been invited to take part, and it's the kind of opportunity that we're looking for elsewhere. So I hope that some of the projects that you're involved in, then we could explore collaborative potential with you, just as we are with that particular project.
I would love that. I mean, you mentioned Kate Raworth earlier. Like because I feel a very strong personal need. Like I moved to Mallorca, an island in the middle of the Mediterranean, 10 years ago, not because, well, partially because I like living in the Mediterranean climate, and Mallorca is a wonderful place to live. I'll admit that, but I also moved here because of the conviction that the locus of focus for creating a viable model of that change is possible, not a cookie cutter model that then has to be implemented everywhere else, but to show that you can turn an entire bioregional economy around towards ecosystems restoration and social and economic regeneration, away from a heavily tourism addicted 80% of the economy coming from tourism regional economy. And now with COVID-19, of course, finally the tourism industry has had that major disruption that I have been talking to them for 10 years about, but they always looked at me as the prophet of doom and said, we're earning more money every year. Who is this guy telling us this isn't, our days are numbered? And so there's a huge opportunity right now to, because of my working with the kind of forefront of the regenerative networks that have been springing up all around the globe, to really invite some of the best people in that field to work with the people of Mallorca and the uniqueness of this Mallorcan case study, to explore a turnaround, because the government is beginning to be much more willing to have those kind of conversations and be inspired. And one of the ideas was, I don't know if you've seen that the Doughnut Economics Action Lab that Kate founded last year has started to work with the Biomimicry Institute, and they've created, funded by the C40 network, the cities network, they've created a methodology called Thriving Places. And now Kate's working with the city of Amsterdam. Amsterdam has called itself a donut city. They've created the methodology of how to basically ground the donut social foundations and within ecological boundaries to ground it in cities. And I've always had this conversation with Kate that ever since Patrick Geddes, we know, who wrote a wonderful book called Cities and Evolution, which if you...
I know it. I know it. He was like back in Darwin's day, he was the father of urban planning.
And so he always said a healthy city can only be planned within its region. And so basically he was one of the first bioregionalists. Yep. In academic terms. Our species is a bioregional species, so that, like, the pattern is much older. But I'm sure that, like, as this is building, I'm also working with the Commonland Foundation, Willem Verweer's work. Are you familiar with the 4 returns approach to ecosystems restoration?
What's it called?
4 returns.
No, I'm not. One of these parallel developments that I don't know about yet.
I'll send you a link. It's a little focused on the entry point is ecosystems restoration, but because Willem Verweer used to be the head of IUCN Netherlands and realized that you can't protect biodiversity hotspots if you don't work with the regional economy and make it an incentive to want it protected. So it's like you can't just, like, if there's economic difficulty in an area, they will impinge on protected biodiversity reserves. So he's developed a very agile language built around the 4 returns: the return of inspiration, the return of ecological capital, social capital, and eventually economic capital. But what is very unique about his approach is that where they engage with a region, they only do so if there's a commitment over 20 years. So they calculate in that the turnaround of an ecological productive system has to have the length of change that the biological system needs. So if you want to go from a heavily degraded landscape to a much more bioproductive landscape, you can have massive effects within the first 3 to 6 years, but to really establish it takes 20 years. And so I'm trying to currently align the stars, so to speak, to work with a number of institutions, also the Capital Institute's regenerative economics approach, to use Mallorca as a case study. And as that matures, I would love to involve you in that. That would be,
well, let me this is so exciting because it's this grand coalescence which needs to take place. And so here's the kind of my part of this coalescing. And it illustrates some of the points we've been made before. So only 2 years ago, I attended a workshop in Seattle, organized by a foundation that was basically a liberal progressive foundation. They wanted to go beyond the neoliberal model. They admired the Mont Pelerin Society, which was the organization that actually established the neoliberal model. And they said, we'd like to repeat that act for a more progressive way of doing things. There I met an economist named Dennis Snower, who I did not know about before, but he's a very important man. He was the president of the Kiel Institute for World Economics, which organizes the T20 and G20 summit meetings. So this is basically a world international economist, and danged if he wasn't a convert to multi-level selection theory. He'd already read about this stuff, and he was persuaded.
Mhm.
He was persuaded. So I started to work with Dennis, and he invited me to the T20 Summit meetings and he started to talk about himself and his own talk. So that's what I said, you know, basically the orthodoxy, the insiders, the established economists are actually being persuaded. It's becoming less heterodox. And he's also involved in the UK. And so he was helpful in me getting a grant from the Economic and Social Science Research Council, which is one of the main foundations in the UK. And they have a whole program within the ESRC called Rebuilding Macroeconomics. So here again, basically, we have soul searching within the establishment. So I got actually quite a small grant to work with Dennis and to implement pro-social. And here's what we did. We organized a training course, and that training course was made available to small teams representing organizations. And this is quite important because this course actually was a 4-tier population structure within the course. The students in the course were, of course, individuals. That's tier 1. There were also members of small teams. That's tier 2. Those teams represented organizations, which I'll shortly list. That's tier 3. And those organizations were interacting with each other through the teams. Mm-hmm. There's tier 4. So what were these organizations? Well, it included Kate Rayworth and Deal. And she brought in Circle Economy, which is organized she also brought in C40, which you've just mentioned, plus a community group called Civic Square, which is based in Birmingham. We'll go down to the community level. We brought in the RSA, the Royal Society for Arts and Manufacturers, which has over 20,000 fellows in its ranks. An organization called the Banking Standards Board, which is a very interesting organization that formed after 2008 to help improve the reputation of the British banking industry. The Transition Network, the Transition Town Network was a team. All of them were taking this course and learning about pro-social in relation to their own organizations, which of course were already very dynamic. And do you know they saw a lot of added value, complementarity basically, not competitors. It's just as like, oh, we already do this. That's not what happened. What happened was, real synergy in terms of these organizations that are already doing, driving towards exactly the right thing. Turns out that actually to think about it more explicitly about managing the cultural evolutionary process, according to evolutionary and complex systems fundamentals, was a considerable added value. And so now we're at the point where we have a great working relationship with Kate and these other organizations that we can actually work together. So any region that wants to become a Doughnut Economics region, such as Amsterdam or any place else, including smaller scales, by all means, because that's definitely the systemic approach that we're working towards. But in order to do that, then I won't quite promise you because that would be too much hubris, but I'm confident that in an effort to do that, if we work at the scale of small groups and then we implement pro-social, then it will go better. Mm-hmm. So, and it is inherently conclusive. I mean, those core design principles are fundamentally democratic and called for co-production, participatory action, all those good things, in which basically the group, starting at the scale of smaller groups, it genuinely consults them as to the role that they want for themselves, what's meaningful for them, and how to achieve it in the context of the greater good. So this makes me optimistic that we could really catalyze the process of cultural evolution by this coalescing that's taking place.
Yeah, I mean, my sense is, I mean, if you haven't had a chance to talk to Michael Bowens and his team from the Peer-to-Peer Foundation, I would be very happy to make an introduction, and I feel like the two of you would have also a lot of overlap and synergy to discover. My sense is how do we, like, I'm definitely committed to working on using Mallorca as a place that convenes collaborations around this. And initially, it's a sort of using Mallorca with the locals as an example to have a concrete place where to apply these ideas and bring together some of the input of Deal and Capital Institute and Commonland into a structure that creates synergies between these different approaches. But there's this concern with regard to redesigning economics that I also wanted to briefly address before we wrap up, because we've already talked a long time. I've noticed that in a lot of the attempts to create an approach to regenerative economics, there's on the one hand, there's Kate's wonderful work, there's John Fullerton's 8 Principles. There are also a lot of people who are trying to create mechanisms by which the very process of changing the state of a degraded landscape from a degenerated, not very productive, eroding landscape towards a increasingly productive and healthier landscape, they want to include that somehow into the economic balance sheets with the best of intentions, in the sense that farmers can then be paid twice, not just for the produce that they regeneratively harvest off their land, but also for the very process of regenerating, for fixing carbon into soil, for improving healthy ecosystems functions. And similarly, there are models that are trying to do that with social regeneration. The danger, and I would love to have your perspective on this, of working with this multi-capital framework within a new type of economic system where it's not just financial capital, but you have social capital and ecological capital and so on and so forth. For me, I've always seen a big danger that it opens the back door for only one little, because of the mathiness of economic theory, only one little maths function that converts financial capital or converts social capital or ecological capital or any of the other capitals into financial capital can then be the backdoor to commoditizing all human relationships and all health relationships within a healthy complex ecosystem. And so with the best of intention created methods actually become complicit in the largest form of enclosure of the commons that has happened yet. I'm a little bit nervous about that, because at the same time I see the need to value social capital and ecological capital within economic balance sheets in a different way. Have you got an opinion on that issue?
I think that descends into a level of detail of implementation that I'm no authority on. And so, and in some sense, I don't have a comment on it specifically, because it's just going to have to be worked out. I mean, basically, it's like, should we do it this way? What are the dangers of doing it this way as opposed to doing it that way? And that reveals a very important point that Ostrom Eleanor made again and again, distinguishing between a functional design principle and its implementation. And so for a group to work well, it needs to implement these design principles in a functional sense, but how they do so is highly contingent on the context. So every group needs to monitor, but how they monitor depends on the context, and so on for all of the design principles. And here I think we're getting into contextual issues of implementation, in which, but one thing we're going to have to do for sure when we assess our practices is to be holistic about it, and to look at, you know, what are the systemic consequences of doing it this way versus that way. So I think that we do want to wrap up, and I want to give a sense of just how this can work. I'm glad that you mentioned multiple forms of capital, because it means that if you're in a situation where there's not much financial capital, but there's other forms of capital, then it's possible to implement pro-social simply because there's a strong appetite for doing so. So for example, if you had any groups that you're working with there, any groups at all, that were really excited about giving pro-social a whirl, I'll find facilitators for you, and it can be done online, so that we can get going. No charge. Of course, if you do have something, you know, any kind of resources, or if a foundation like the Peer-to-Peer Foundation or any other foundation would like to facilitate it and incentivize it, so that people actually have financial capital in addition to their other forms of capital, well, of course it'll go better, as long as we use those funds in the right way. But we don't have to wait for the money in order to do this. There does have to be, of course, enthusiasm for doing it. People have to be willing to meet and to act on the basis of what they decide. There has to be some form of capital, but we're structuring pro-social obviously to sustain itself. So it has to have a financial model, but to sustain itself in a way that it could offer itself for free, basically, when necessary.
The EPSRC work you mentioned earlier, is there a report that I could share with people locally, or is that too recent to have been written up yet?
Oh, there's lots of stuff, and I'm happy to be present and other people to talk about possibilities. There's a lot that I can share about that. If you wanted to approach groups, then we'll talk about that offline.
Great. Well, this has been rich and opening up a very hopeful window towards future conversations and future collaborations. So it's a real, thank you so much for the last 2 hours. Can't believe we almost got 2 hours.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your time, and I'll be in touch soon, and I look forward to meeting you in person, hopefully in not too distant future.
Okay, maybe on a Mediterranean island somewhere.
Yeah, that's the little carrot I've got here. It's a good location. People like to work with Mallorca as a case study because it's a good excuse to come here for a research trip. Great. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and thank you so much. It'll probably take me maybe a week or two to upload this, but I'll send you the link once it's up.
Of course. Great. Good. Happy
Wonderful.
to share it.
Bye-bye.
All righty. Take care.